Okay, so Bret Stephens in the house, first timer. Thanks so much for being here.
It's an honor to finally meet you
I know it's very strange.
after all these years.
I feel like, in some ways, I feel like John Wayne in The Searchers or something, where every time I go into some small town, and I see the campfires on the outskirts. It's like Stephens has been here. Um, um, anyway, so we could do a lot. We can come at this a lot of different ways, but you wrote a column sort of which I'm sympathetic with in a lot of ways, slight disagreements in others. Basically saying, all right, enough with the never Trump stuff. He's
Hmm.
president now, right? Which is, I wrote a similar thing in 2016 saying never Trump, never more, because once he's president, you only have one president at a time and you want them to succeed. And so going full resistance all the time is a waste of everybody's time. Pick your battles. And I agree with that. So we're a month later, more or less, a month into the Trump presidency. How you feeling about it?
Oh, not great. Um, Look, I one of my lessons, or one of the lessons I tried to draw in that column, which was, I guess, in December, was we critics of Trump need to learn to pick our spots, and we need to learn to be more gracious. From time to time, he will do things that I generally agree with. And in fact sometimes embrace, and it's important to acknowledge that. But I think that my earliest fears about Trump, that he represents a retreat from the kind of broad liberal democratic values which define not only the United States but also um, the best of the West for the past, at least since the past 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, that he's very much embarked on that journey, and that it's going to have a bad destination. I mean, there are two forms of conservatism. There's a kind of 20th century American conservatism, late 20th century American conservatism, which essentially existed to safeguard bedrock liberal values. Um, uh, and then there's a kind of a blood and soil conservatism, which J.D. Vance gave voice to uh, in his speech at the Republican National Convention, really, rooted in the soil where he plans to be buried. Much more nationalistic, much more closed off to the foreign world, much more protectionist. And I think that's where we're heading, and I don't think it's going to have a particularly good destination. It's as if the history of the world has been rewritten, and Robert Taft became president in 1952 instead of Dwight Eisenhower, and here we are. And so my question is: are there voices inside the administration, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, who can check those impulses when it comes to the administration's foreign policy? And are there sufficient checks inside the United States that can stop Trump from embarking on some of his most harebrained and frankly unconstitutional bids, like ending birthright citizenship guaranteed by the 14th Amendment?
I I get the argument that these guys think they're all realpolitik. I get the argument that that they think they're sovereigntists or whatever the right term we're supposed to be using these days for. But here you have J.D. Vance at Munich, and I was told we had to get rid of these neocons who only care about like pushing liberal values and lecturing people about the importance of democracy, and we need people who care about realpolitik. And here comes Vance, who's supposed to talk about what the administration's policy is going to be towards, I don't know, Russia and national security. And instead, he hectors them about how Germany has fallen short of liberal values. He hectors them about how Romania canceled some regional elections where some fascists did well or something like that.
It
And
was a
he's over.
presidential election, but it was almost certainly there was almost certainly outside interference. But go ahead, yeah,
Right. And so he's saying, and worrying
yeah.
about anti-interference. My point is he's lecturing them about the integrity of their democracies. He's lecturing them about their commitment to liberal values. I mean, what is free speech if not a liberal value? Um, the fact that that his selective outrage seems to be centered on the AfD and this the far right, neo-fascist adjacent crowd is its own interesting thing. But how is that? I mean, what makes that so realpolitik?
Well, no, that's exactly right. In fact, that's the theme of my column for this evening. Realpolitik means a certain kind of benign indifference or not so benign indifference to the internal politics of the countries with which you must deal. We would not appreciate a French socialist being given a platform at the American Conservative Union to tell Americans to cut their working hours and raise their minimum wage and lecture them on how the United States falls short in the workers' rights department. And that's essentially the way I think Vance's speech landed at Munich. I mean, it was particularly obnoxious because we fought 2 world wars in order to make Germany a country with which we could live, and they have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. I mean, the greatest problem in Europe today is German pacifism, which in the long arc of history is just the most astonishing
It's a champagne
accomplishment.
problem historically.
It's exactly. And there he is making common cause with a party that, if it came to power, would want to remove the Holocaust memorial in the center of Berlin. At least one of its leaders has essentially said as much. More to the point, a party that is in many ways openly sympathetic to the Russians and to the Chinese, and that has a long history of anti-Americanism. So it's just an astonishing either monument of ignorance based on hypocrisy from Vance, or something actually darker, sympathy towards some of the really ugly impulses that lie at the heart of the AfD, which is essentially to get rid of not just illegal immigrants or refugees in that country, but to get rid of German citizens who have a, quote, foreign national origin. The Germans who have been German for generations, but don't have so-called German blood. And that really takes you back to the 1930s. It takes you back to a very dark place. Why is the Vice President of the United States so sympathetic to them? That was to me, a just shocking moment in American history, and historians will look back on it with shame.
Yeah, I mean, I'm appalled. I mean, as we're talking, there's some clips of Marco Rubio selling some provisional idea for a peace deal with Russia. I don't know the details of it, but lots of under Comrade Trump, this heroic man of peace, world's greatest negotiator, we will have blah, blah, blah. And it does, the fact that Ukraine, I guess George Will made this point this morning, but the fact that Ukraine has been carved out of this does give these talks, does give a kind of Munich 1938, 1939 vibe to all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Neville Chamberlain formula: negotiate with the dictator over the backs of the people who are the victims. I mean, it's astounding that Zelensky was the second call after the warm first call between Trump and Putin, that Zelensky is merely being informed, not even consulted. Now, there are many things to say about the way, in particular, in which the Europeans, and I would say in particular the German government of Olaf Scholz, have really fallen short of their stated commitments. And there's a lot to be said also for telling Europe that they need to grow up, have an actual defense policy, not simply be this freeloading continent that is happy to sell Mercedes to China and Airbuses around the world, but won't really invest enough in a meaningful defense capability. All those things are absolutely legitimate, and I would not have been sorry if J.D. Vance had pressed that point home where better than at the Munich Security Conference. But essentially, he is lecturing Germany on the ways in which he feels it falls short of free speech values, while coddling the greatest oppressor, the greatest suppressor of free speech in the world today, who is surely Vladimir Putin, with competition from his friends in Beijing and Tehran, of course.
Yeah, and Pyongyang, but yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Also, so Pete Hegseth, I saw reference Poland as the ideal NATO partner, and I think in a lot of sense that's true.
Yeah.
But why are they spending? They're out spending the highest proportion of GDP of any country on defense. Good for them. They should be. All of them should be trying to catch up with Poland. That's great. They're spending more as a percent of GDP than we are. It's great. Why are they doing that? Because Russia is a threat to them, and it's very weird. It's like they like the behavior, they don't, but they just sort of utterly reject the reason for why Poland is an ideal NATO partner in their eyes.
Look, there's a kind of an incoherence in the very structure of Trump's, the foreign policy side of his cabinet. You have traditional hawks, one might even say neocons like Marco Rubio, right? And Mike Waltz is certainly not far behind. And then kind of bizarre Looney Tune conspiracy theorists like Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence. And my guess is the administration will move in, its impulses will move in very opposite and not necessarily coherent, intellectually coherent directions. But, the underlying theory of the case somehow seems to be that that American alliances are only liabilities; they're never assets, and I think that's extraordinarily foolish. I mean, look, let's complain all we want about low German defense spending, and it's a perfectly legitimate complaint. I'd rather have Germany as a free loader off American power than as a freelancer. Because when Germany decides to conduct its own independent foreign policy, bad things tend to happen. I just am mindful of the last, 107 odd years or 108 odd years of history. 11, excuse me.
So broadening out, I've taken the position now for it feels like 1,000 years, but a little less than a decade, that there is no safe harbor for any committed intellectual or ideologue who supports Trump, because eventually any commitment to a coherent program will run into the problem that Trump doesn't do coherent programs, right? He doesn't do coherent ideological arguments. He actually takes pride of it. He says, I go with my instincts. I change. I want to be unpredictable, right? And that's not what intellectuals and ideologues do, who try to be consistent within their worldviews and all that.
Yeah, Trump is an ego in search of an idea. That's my definition for him.
I think that's fair. I mean, but my point is that because there's no safe harbor, intellectual safe harbor, you end up seeing a lot of people fall back on personal loyalty to the man, right? Like, I just trust his instincts. Whatever he says goes, right? And I think that used to be purely a psychological argument, but it feels to me, the egghead argument for this is a personalist regime where it just basically does what all-powerful personality, Putin, Xi, whoever, wants, and the only search for consistency begins and ends with consistently being loyal to whatever he wants. This creates a real problem for people like you and me who want to, we kind of grew up wanting to argue with ideas, and I find that it's not like the Trump administration lacks for ideas. It obviously has ideas. It just seems to me that they are almost all pretextual. They're all downstream of this personalist understanding of whatever Trump thinks is a good idea, as we're all going to agree is a good idea because he's got some special, Gnostic insight into the nature of the universe or whatever. And first of all, do you think that's right? And second of all, what does that portend for the next 3.5 years of writing columns if we're constantly like drunks with car keys looking for our car keys with the light is good? We want to argue with ideas, and like these people I don't think honestly care about ideas in the way that we've been accustomed to since 1945.
They have, look, it's not, there are impulses, right? I'm not sure an impulse is exactly an idea, but it does tend to lead in particular directions. There are impulses and biases. out of which ideas sort of emerge, and sometimes they are mediated through Trump's. No, they're always mediated through Trump's narcissism and his immediate political needs. So yeah, it does make it really challenging to write about this guy. And if I knock Trump hard in one column and then I have something slightly positive to say about ending DEI in the military, for example, I'm gonna be told by 1,000 readers that it's just more evidence that I'm just, essentially pro-Trump and so on. And I think my role is just to try to maintain a kind of intellectual consistency and sense of fidelity to the ideas I brought with me to politics long before Trump, descended his magic escalator. But it's not at all easy. Also, because a policy can be announced and then it can be reversed on the very next day,
Right.
And you have to sort of take care to maintain a sense of kind of restraint and not jump at the bait every single time. I mean, I'm mindful of the 2-day crisis of 25% tariffs on Canada that now I guess is in abeyance, at least for the next, I don't know how many days until that's negotiated. It's just hard to write about this guy, and I'm doing my best, but I also, there's certain moments like Vance's speech in Munich that I do think are going to be landmarks, that are going to have consequences, and that you have to call them out for the mistake is too nice a word, for the ignominious moments that they are. It's up there in my mind with Trump's Helsinki appearance with Putin in 2018.
Yeah, no, I agree with you about Vance, and Vance wants to be known as a consistent thinker.
Yeah,
right? He actually comes from that milieu, and I don't think he's nearly as consistent a thinker. I mean, trying to square his very good speech about AI with his other views about the rest of the economy, it leads one to think that maybe his love of innovation and deregulation for AI, but not for the steel industry or anything else, stems from the fact that he's a creature of Silicon Valley and Peter Thiel and those guys. And
look, one dominant theme is disruption. Like, these are one of the reasons why I think Silicon Valley, or at least some people in Silicon Valley, have gotten so behind Trump. And these are people I admire as entrepreneurs, as contrarian thinkers, really interesting first-class minds. They came of age, or they came up in a milieu, to use a 10-cent word, in which disruption was always good. Like, to be a disruptor, it was always the highest form of praise, right? And there are a lot of areas of life that really require disruption. And I don't think that impulse is necessarily a bad one. Our public education system needs to be disrupted. Our higher education system needs to be disrupted. The way in which we organize government agencies that emerge out of the early 20th century or late 19th century, that has to change as well. None of that is necessarily bad, but the federal government is not necessarily a place where you just move fast and break things. Okay, it's just not the zone for it. And I what I think we're now going to experience in this administration are the manifold defects of an occasional virtue, which is to break shit up, to shake the rafters, so to speak. And that's going to be, I think that's not only going to be destructive, in many ways it's going to wind up being self-defeating, because if the lesson that emerges from the next 4 years or whatever, 3 years, 11 months of Trump is, we had this disruption and we were left with ruin, then any future attempts at disruption are going to be met with broad public opposition, because they will have a memory of this administration as something that just broke stuff up that needed to be reformed and repaired, not blown up.
yeah, I mean, I'm with you all in on this. I think I agree with you about disruption has its place. I've been writing columns for 25 years that you can't run government like a business, because they're just different categories of thing, of institution. But Yuval says, the main problem, the driving problem with these guys is they still think the government is something other than their thing, right?
Yeah.
That they're there to attack the government when they are the government.
Yeah.
And when you don't think you're the government, you're not going to govern, right?
It's that famous ad where the mailman comes into the C-suite and the guy in the C-suite is like, stick it to the man. And the guy, some low, employee is like, but sir, you are the man. I don't know if you remember that ad.
All right. So switching gears, there are a lot of ways I can get into this, but I'll just do it matter of factly. We're just past the 500-day mark with the October 7th attacks in Israel. Where do you see things standing right now?
Hard to say. You're getting mixed signals from Bibi Netanyahu, who, a week ago was saying we're going to basically go to war again unless all hostages are released. Now he's back to the original plan. I don't know if that's if he took a stern phone call from Steve Witkoff, or maybe he just looked at Israeli opinion polls, which showed that a majority of Israelis really want to prefer getting all the hostages back to going to war. Also hard to say what inroads the U.S. is going to be able to make with friendly Arab countries to come to some resolution that amounts to more than just the status quo ante, with Hamas basically still in power in Gaza, and the international community, such as it is, on the hook for paying for its reconstruction. What I wanted, and I wrote this last week, what I was hoping for is, and this is, by the way, one of those areas where a guy like Trump in the White House has his uses, to say, look, Arab world, you have a choice, okay? Either we're going to push all the Palestinians into temporary housing in the Sinai and take care of whatever remains of Hamas there. Surely you don't want that. Or you're going to work with us to get every single Hamas fighter out of Gaza while the civilian population of Gaza remains there. Put them to that very, very tough choice, and they'll make the right decision, which is, I think, getting Hamas to leave Gaza the way the PLO left Lebanon back in 1982. And maybe that's still on the table. At least it's still being thought about. But I don't know. What I do know is that if Hamas remains in power in Gaza, even if it's under the fig leaf of some kind of Palestinian Authority administration, we are going to be right back to where we were on October 6th. And it's a calamity for Israel, but a survivable one because Israel's strong. It is a much larger calamity for Palestinians. This is a separate thought, Jonah, but I wish we had a real pro-Palestinian movement in this country, as opposed to the pro-Hamas movement, which is anti-Palestinian. Because if you support leaving Hamas in any form of power in Gaza, there's never going to be a Palestinian state. And I'm waiting for voices in the pro-Palestinian community to reach this absolutely unquestionable point that no Israeli government, even a Meretz government, even the farthest left Israeli government, is not going to accept the duplication in the West Bank of what they experienced in Gaza. They're not. It's a non-starter anywhere in the Israeli political spectrum. So if you want to operate in the world of reality and make it at all possible that there's a horizon for a Palestinian state, you want the destruction of Hamas as a political force. If not, you're not really for a two-state solution. You're not for a Palestinian state. You're for endless war, endless suffering for Palestinians, at the end of which Israel is going to win every single time because Israel is simply a stronger and more cohesive political entity than its Palestinian rivals. That's the case. So let's have a pro-Palestinian movement in this country that actually starts speaking sense about what realistic options are going forward. I'd love to see that happen.
I mean, I agree with you entirely on the merits. I mean, I remember, was it Martin Kramer used to write about how the Middle East studies profession got so caught up with the desire for Muslim Martin Luther that they didn't realize that what they really wanted was a Muslim Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Because you don't want a Martin Luther per se, for all sorts of historical reasons that we probably don't need to go into. But they kind of had that with the Salafists and all these kinds of groups. Anyway, the point I was going to make isn't the problem with that? Orwell has this great bit where he talks about how if there's a Gandhi in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany, we don't know who he is because he and his family are pulled out of their beds in the middle of the night and sent to camps or shot in the back of the head. I agree with you practically entirely. If the Israelis faced sort of peaceful, nonviolent protesters, they would have gotten out of the tanks and refused to fight a long time ago. I mean, that's not an observation from me. That's a common sort of a cliche among Israelis. How do you get that when Hamas is perfectly willing to kill, and not just Hamas, but Hamas-like groups, anyone who tries to make that kind of argument in a public way, particularly on the ground down there?
Yeah, it's at this moment, it's next to impossible, and it really says something about the degradation of Palestinian political culture. Although, when I say degradation, I think, well, degraded from what? Yasser Arafat and his holster. But the one place where that form of politics might be possible is actually on American college campuses. Mm-hmm. If there were professors, Arab, Palestinian, or otherwise, who could actually form a credible, not a credible, but at least an authentic and courageous movement, authentic, courageous, and credible, let me put it that way, saying the way Palestinian politics is not where we want to go. And I've heard voices, people keep talking about Salam Fayyad, although I think he's very much a kind of a has-been in Palestinian politics. You have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere. The ultimate purpose of Zionism is Jewish self-rule. It's not being ruled by others. It's not ruling over others. And so at least in a theoretical way, in an ideal way, Israel should not be in the business of controlling the lives of a population that doesn't want to be controlled by Israel. It was forced into it, essentially, by decades of bad faith by the Arab side, from the Khartoum Declaration and even before then, all the way up until the present. But right now, there's just nothing. There's absolutely nothing. I mean, there's that guy, what's his name, the son of Hamas, who he's very, very impressive. He's quite something, but he's a guy who speaks to essentially Jewish audiences. Where's the guy? Where's the Palestinian leader, at least in the West, making that case to Muslim audiences, saying that we have driven ourselves into the wall at the end of the cul-de-sac, and just keeping our foot on the accelerator is not going to get us anywhere. I'm just wondering where that person is, and that person, at least if he's in the West, might have a chance of not being pulled out of his bed at night and having the soles of his feet beaten by the Hamas police force.
So this kind of gets. I mean, I agree with you in principle that this is the kind of conversation that should happen on college campuses, but I don't know. Doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, doesn't it feel like the reason why there's not that conversation on college campuses is that when put to the test, right? The all virtues are courage is the essence of all, is the most important virtue. Cicero or C.S. Lewis, because it's the one at the testing point.
No, I thought it was John McCain who said that.
Yeah, well,
no, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
My point is,
I think McCain was fond of that quote, but yeah.
Yeah, when push comes to shove, the quote unquote pro-Palestinian movements on these college campuses really are more about being anti-Israel than pro-Palestinian.
Oh, they're purely about being anti-Israel.
Yeah, I mean, so
the Palestinians are just a stand-in for.
I mean, it kind of brings us back to the Munich conversation. They're kind of the Sudeten Germans, right? They're just a prop for a larger project. But how do you navigate this stuff? I mean, you're you're associated with this Jewish Affairs journal.
I am.
Which,
you mean Sapir?
Sapir. I'm sorry, my brain was not recalling it. And
here it is. It's a.
There you go. I get it, and I read it often. I read a lot of things, and my brain.
No, I understand. My brain is melting also.
That said, so how do you navigate this? Because certainly, I would argue. I mean, you've written these columns. I've written these columns. The UN is structurally anti-Semitic. If you take the concept of structural racism or structural sexism seriously, disparate impact, right? I mean, Hillel Neuer does these data compilations of denunciations that are just irrefutable, and yet there is this capacity for people to still there's oxygen for people to say it's outrageous to say that anti-Semitism plays a role in all of this, and yet it so obviously does. Like, do you have a heuristic or a rule of thumb about how to navigate the charge that, that you're being unfair when you accuse people of anti-Semitism when they criticize Israel?
I never accuse people of anti-Semitism when they criticize
Israel. No, but
Israel. When the criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, I accuse them of anti-Semitism, and there's a fairly clear way of delineating that. I mean, you can criticize the United States all you want, American policy all you want. Nobody calls us critics of President Trump anti-American. We think that it's the essence of being an American. Nobody criticizes French critics of Macron of being anti-French. It's when you call for the destruction of the entire enterprise, the entire state, which happens to be the Jewish state, that it tips over into outright anti-Semitism. And yes, there are a couple of exceptions that you could theoretically carve out. If you're an ultra-Orthodox Jew who happens not to believe like the Neturei Karta movement,
right,
then you're fine. Okay, well then prove to me that you're also living in Muncie or whatever, and you belong to that sect. I'll take your word for it. You're not an anti-Semite. And by the same token, if you're against all nations in general, the Icelandic nation, Japan, an ethnically pure state or almost totally ethnically pure, you name it, you just believe in world government, then you're perfectly within your rights to say, well, within that framework, I also don't believe in the Jewish nation, right? But if you're simply singling out one nation and claiming that it alone is illegitimate, that is the double standard by which anti-Semitism is almost always recognized. If furthermore, you're also saying that Israel is guilty of gratuitously murdering Palestinian children, reveling in the blood of its enemies, harvesting their organs, committing genocide, and behaving like Nazis, all of these are tropes, basically being the essence of evil in the modern world, and an evil that can only be that can't simply be defeated but must be annihilated. Okay, then you are repeating every single anti-Semitic trope that we've known for more than 2,000 years. So I've just. That to me is not difficult. Look, what is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews are uniquely prone to use devious means to achieve malevolent ends and must therefore be opposed by all means or all ways necessary, including the use of violence. That's my one-sentence definition of anti-Semitism. I think it's better than the IRA definition, which is very clunky. That definition is richly applies to the anti-Israel, anti-Zionist protesters on college campuses. They're not looking at what Turkey has. They're not looking at Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. They're not looking at India's policies in Kashmir, Chinese policies in Tibet. To them, it's the Jews who are uniquely prone to this particular kind of evil. It's the only thing they're interested in protesting. They don't care that the United States underwrites Turkish security even as the Turks behave atrociously towards Kurds. They don't give a shit about the Kurds. They have never even heard of the Kurds. There's one oppressed people, purportedly oppressed people that they care about. It's the Palestinians. And there's one purported oppressor they care about, and it's the Jews. It's the Israelis. That, to me, is unmistakable anti-Semitism. And the same people who are capable of seeing evidence of racism in what appear to many people to be innocuous comments or fair game comments, who are alert to every fucking microaggression on the planet, right, suddenly become gleeful macroaggressors when it comes to the Jews. So I'm sorry, but I'm not willing to switch off my brain to give moral passes to elite university students who towards whom we should have every expectation that they should know better. I'm just simply not. And by the way, the professors who either support that or make excuses for them, to me, are just as bad as people who support or make excuses for the worst elements in the conservative right-wing movement in the United States. You know, if you're saying, oh, you know, Marjorie Taylor Greene has no idea about the Rothschilds, right? You know, that's the equivalent of these professors saying, well, these poor students, you know, they're just idealists, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same phenomenon. Sorry for the tirade, but it is infuriating to see not only the moral ignominy of these protesters, but the moral abdication of their supposed tutors and professors and administrators when it comes to this baseline question of anti-Semitism. It's unbelievable. And universities that have essentially turned the other way or made excuses have every... I look forward to the day. I look forward to the day when people pity poor Upper West Side families that have no choice but to send their kids to Columbia because Vanderbilt and the University of Chicago weren't interested in what they had to offer.
All right, so I'm with you on all that, and I know you have a urgent deadline you got to get out of here. But just sort of to bring it around to the beginning, one of the things I resent about this whole era is that, you know, I was normally the guy who people said, Jonah, you should rein it in a bit, right? Jonah, you know, this is not a time for jocularity. That joke's offensive, right? And I've been sort of cornered into this position of being the scold and the finger wagger and the responsible guy. And in that process, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate, which again, when I used to hear people talk about the importance of truth, it would make me want to grab the guy's guitar and smash it against the Delta House wall, right? I mean, it's like, this is, you know, I gave my love a Jerry kind of schmaltz. But with the pro-Hamas people, with so many of the people on the far left and on the far right in America, the single easiest tell that their position is weak or that they're up to no good is whether or not they're willing to actually use real facts, true facts, as Casey Stengel would put it, for their arguments. And this is my problem with the disruptor crowd, to bring it back. I agree with you entirely. Higher ed needs huge disruption. Middle East peace process, huge disruption. But it undermines the credibility of your case if you're not telling the truth as part of if you're using lies to foster the disruption. Yeah. So when Elon Musk does all of his stuff where he talks about stuff he's discovered that nobody knew, which has been on websites around the country for since there have been websites, and when he characterizes the stuff that he finds as mass conspiracies and the federal government has been secretly funding Politico and all these kinds of things, it is a sign of either unseriousness or serious cynicism and poor and bad motives.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to do the things that we do for a living in an era where people are so contemptuous, not just of the truth, but contemptuous of the idea that there are sources of truth. And I'm wondering how you see that.
So an essay that had a great effect on me was Václav Havel's, I guess it's 1977 or 78, The Power of the Powerless. And it's a long essay. It'll take 2 hours to read it, but it's worth those 2 hours of your life. he talks about the importance of living in truth. And in his case, he's talking about the sort of totalitarian, or what he calls post-totalitarian Czechoslovakia, where slogans are everywhere and people are supposed to believe this because it's actually just convenient to believe this. It's convenient for the greengrocer, in Havel's example, to put a little sign among his, the apples he's selling that says, workers of the world unite. And it's convenient for the shopkeeper across the street to also post a sign that says, you have nothing to lose but your chains. And he describes how this kind of creates a panorama, as he puts it, kind of like a Truman Show of false facts, of false realities. And then he goes on to talk about the importance of the individual who just decides to live in truth, right? It's not necessarily an act of holding a placard, in the central square in Prague, or open political defiance. It's just to live according to the facts as they really are, and how defiant that is, and how important that is. And he then goes on to say, one person does this, he's going to be thrown into whatever the Czech equivalent of the Lubyanka was. But you start to have hundreds and then thousands of people doing this. In the case of Czechoslovakia, was the Charter 77 movement. And that starts to break up the panorama that the regime has constructed. Now, I'm not comparing the Trump administration to a regime. It's not a totalitarian state. Here we have freely having this conversation. I'm not expecting to get arrested by Kash Patel the moment I stand up from this microphone. But in the panorama of conservative thought, I think it's so important to just be able to say, that's bullshit, and that's bullshit, and that's bullshit, and that's not bullshit, because I'm seeing it for what it is. But I'm going to call out the bullshit every time I have a chance to do it. I'm not going to do it monomaniacally. I'm going to try to do it with a sense of humor and a sense of proportion. I'm not going to make hyperbolic analogies to the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich, right? But I am going to try to live in truth. I'm going to try to be honest and consistent and stay true to my inner perception of the way that the world is. And that's what I try to do. I don't do it perfectly by any means, but I've tried to work my way towards some sense of a kind of honesty with myself, so that I can wake up in the morning and say, I wrote that column for no one else except for me. And if you agree with it, great. And if you don't, and you think I'm an idiot, that's fine too. And I'm going to do it for as long as I can until, in the immortal words of Saint, I don't know, I fuck the fuck off, right? I mean, probably shouldn't have said that, but there you have it.
I would not have predicted that in the history of this podcast we've had more F-bombs from Bret Stephens than maybe any other guest.
Well, you don't know me, so yeah, I have a foul mouth, but I felt that I gather the remnant comes from this concept of the saving remnant. It's Is that it?
It's the original inspiration is from Albert J. Nock. But it's also Walter Benjamin and a bunch of people. And originally it's from an essay that Nock wrote for The Atlantic in the 1930s called Isaiah's Job. So really it's the story of Isaiah. And yes, it's that there's a minimal, irreducible number of people out there who care about...
If there are 10 good men left in the city, yeah. Right. Well, he's silent on that point, but anyway.
The remnant part is that remnant is both evocative of being left behind, something left behind, but also something that you can build on for the future, a seed for the future. And that's how I feel. The very few of us left who still feel like we're taking crazy pills and still believe in basic sort of Reaganite or Buckleyite, conservatism, or in my case, Irving Kristol conservatism. There are dozens of us out there.
Well, every now and then some random person comes up to me and says, I feel like you're my island of sanity, or words to that effect. And I can't tell you how much it means to me. Like if it's just to that one person or a handful of people for whom, I am roughly speaking, a solid ground in a kind of a torrent of craziness, then I feel like, well, I've maybe, done something with my life. And so that's what I try to do. And as you said, yeah, there are a few of us who are trying to hold on to an idea of what a healthy conservative movement looks like, because in the words of Maximus the Gladiator, that is not it. My favorite movie, at any rate.
All right, so Bret Stephens, I told you I'd get you out of here quickly, a little on the early side.
Thank you, Jonah. I'm so honored to be on your show, and sorry for my foul mouth.
We'll have you back, and we'll have a conversation about whether to bleep stuff.